Good evening. Three things before I get started. First, I came because there was free pizza. Now if you're a student or you're at a university, that's one of your main ways of subsisting. Second, I was invited on a cold night, so it's probably warm hearts, cold hands, something like that in Minnesota. And third, no pressure, but Doug starts off. We've had really great presentations in the past. Wow, that's a tough deal right away. So I hope to at least live up to that a little. So what I'm going to talk about is St. Thomas and our energy programs there this evening. If you have questions, let's just ask them on the way. There's these, how many have seen these hooks that you get sheep with or grab people off a stage? There's somebody in the wings there at 7 o'clock I get yanked, so we'll go from there. So, but if you have questions, please just kind of ask on the way, because otherwise I forget them. Okay, so this is, I just titled this University of St. Thomas Energy, UST. I'm the director of the Master's MS program in Electrical Engineering, which is probably, I believe, probably one of the largest power programs in the United States at the master's level. We have about 75 grad students in the program, and about 70 are doing power. And I know of no other program with so many grad students. And I run the Renewable Energy and Alternatives Laboratory. So I'll give you a bit of background because independent of engineering has been at St. Thomas now for probably 3 decades. It's a well-kept secret. So I'll briefly cover engineering there, and then I'm going to talk about microgrids a bit, some trends. If you don't know what a grid is, you have a little better idea tonight, and then some examples of some of the things related to these. So, engineering at St. Thomas, the School of Engineering. Well, this is Central Campus. We're not there. But it's a nice picture. So Perry, where are you at, Perry? Oh, Perry goes, I can't get solar at St. Thomas. So we see all those nice limestone buildings. St. Thomas was founded in 1885, and it's kind of like Minnesota Historic Society. It's like formaldehyde and an apple. You don't change it. Okay, so putting panels on things like this would probably deface them, and the university doesn't like that. But it kind of looks nice anyway. On the south of Summit Avenue is the engineering building, which is on the left, and that's a plumb bob. So kind of the idea behind that little statue thingy is, how many know what a plumb bob is? Because they're kind of out of always lasers today. But you kind of hold a plumb bob on a string. It gives you a true reference, blah, blah, blah. And engineering is supposed to be like that. Actually, St. Thomas hates engineers. Okay? Because engineers don't have opinions. We use data. At a liberal arts university, when it was all said and done, there's been a lot more said than done. So we have this very large part of the university now, as I'll show you, that we use data. And the rest of the university doesn't like that because they have their opinions, but then we say, well, show me the data for your opinion. We want to talk about it. Anyway, so that plumb bob's kind of important. Kind of the vision for the School of Engineering. You don't have to read this whole thing. I highlighted it in red. We are getting close to being a nationally recognized leader of engineering. Reflect vitality and that kind of good stuff. But for entrepreneurial spirit, we do a lot of entrepreneurialism. We have a very liberal intellectual property position. Faculty, if they invent something, basically own it. We kind of like to keep in touch with the university, so we hold to the general mission. Lots of perspectives and technical literacy, kind of big deals for engineering at St. Thomas. So, you may not realize this, but today the School of Engineering is the largest part of the university. It's larger than the perennial founding parts of the university, which are business, law, and education. Engineering surpassed law about 8 years ago. It surpassed education about 6 years ago, and 4 years ago it surpassed business. Today, roughly 1 in 7 St. Thomas students is an engineer. Okay? So it's a big deal. In
I
fact,
congratulate you. I think that's wonderful.
what's that?
I congratulate you. I
Oh.
think that is wonderful.
Well, actually, it's kind of not me, but
But thank you.
how many have heard of economics? If engineering left the university, the doors closed. St. Thomas, a liberal arts university without engineering is almost not economically viable today. Okay? Times have changed. Okay, so how many have heard of millennials and post-millennials? They do not view things similar. I look around here, the age group. Okay, they don't view things as kind of the age demographic in this room. It's not saying it's better, it's worse, but it is different. And while the liberal arts have held high esteem historically, it does not for the millennials. So the engineering program is really important at our liberal arts university that employs me. So our undergraduate engineering degrees, we have engineering, yes, but we are not the U. Our goal is not to be engineering for everybody. We basically have two engineering programs, electrical and mechanical. I bolded them because if you're into kind of the academic side of things, computer engineering is really close to electrical engineering. So if you have an electrical engineering program, add a course or two in Banner, you've got computer engineering. And civil engineering is really similar to mechanical. Likewise, add a couple of courses in a mechanical program, becomes civil. So those are our 4 undergraduate engineering programs. We got a lot of grad programs, okay? But here's kind of the ones I thought were salient for this evening. Electrical engineering has 4 main areas of emphasis, but power is the dominant one, like 98%. Mechanical engineering is a big program as well. We have graduate programs in software, which focuses on large data and cybersecurity. And in the medical field, we're really well known as part of having a really good regulatory. I used to work, one of the hats I wore was Boston Scientific. So the regulatory program is quite well thought of at St. Thomas as a grad program. We just introduced some new stuff. I don't want to kind of bore you too much, but we have focus areas, power, smart grid, electric vehicles, communications, and what most electrical engineers like, which is embedded systems, aka programming. So, growth areas for the power program. When I started the program in 2011, power was its main focus. It's now expanding in several ways into electric vehicles. I know Yuka. He's one of our leaders for electric vehicles. We do a lot of microgrid work, as you'll see now. And in terms of power, Internet of Things and microsensors which scavenge energy from the environment. That's also power, it's just small power. So we kind of do big power and small power now as part of our engineering program at St. Thomas. So with that as background, I want to switch gears and move into microgrids and what's driving them. So, 2 things, need and sustainability. Okay? Now, in the United States, microgrids will probably never be a big deal. But in the rest of the world, okay, so quiz time, I'm a professor. Oh my gosh, test anxiety. How many people on the planet Earth are there?
I disagree. I think microgrids are going to be important.
Not in the United States.
I think they are.
I'll go with you.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you. There you go. 7 billion people, 4 billion do not have access to electricity. 2 reasons for that lack of access: cost or non-existence. So that's 4 billion people microgrids will service. Now, the reason I say it's not a big deal in the United States, how many people are in the United States? 400 million. That's 0.4 billion. So there are 10 times more people than there are in the United States who don't have electricity. And by simple democratic majority, that's where microgrids are going to go. That's the biggest chunk of the planet. That's where the big market and potential is.
By microgrids, do you mean small grids?
Yep. And I'll talk a little bit more about that and kind of show you and so forth. But the point is, there's a need. Also, since these smaller power systems, by the way, I've done microgrids, as I'll show you, from a few kilowatts to 20 megawatts. Okay, the microgrid that is 20 megawatts was still a microgrid. It's just, it wasn't necessarily small. But 20 megawatts, if you're a Monticello nuclear power plant, that's a, well, how many have seen Back to the Future? 1.21 gigawatts. You know, it's a gigawatt. That's 1,000 megawatts. Okay, that's big power. So 20 megawatts is still kind of tiny against what a nuclear power plant would produce, for example. So sustainability is important on microgrids simply because much of the energy sources that are used on a microgrid are renewable in nature fundamentally. They don't have to be. I mean, you can run a diesel generator, which some people say is not sustainable. If it ran on biodiesel, it is sustainable. So you know, it depends on how you slice and dice it. But sustainability is important. One of the things I want to bring to your attention that's not popular to talk about is what I call the 5X hit of petroleum. It's, I hope, shocks you. So, first of all, we have 5 uses of petroleum today, and it's not sustainable for several reasons. That's not the purpose of it. First is worldwide electrical generation. Independent of the fact the United States is decommissioning coal plants, the rest of the world's building them as fast as they can. So 2/3 of the world's power today continues to come from coal, and that's increasing. So right there is an environmental aspect as well as greenhouse gases and a host of other things. And a lot of problems with coal are not even the greenhouse gases, it's a lot of the heavy metals that are in them that when you start burning end up in the air as well as in the water. One of the main heavy metals is this nice little thing called arsenic. Okay, so it's kind of nasty. For a transportation sector, 95% of all of our world transportation, how many ever saw Steve Martin planes, trains, and automobiles? Okay, 95% of all what drives our transportation infrastructure for the planet comes from petroleum. Most of our modern materials, okay, so I kind of want to draw your attention to 3 things. Cell phone, number 1, impossible without petroleum-based materials. I happen to be a Microsoft, not bigot, not a Apple, so for the Apple people, I mean, no offense, I don't mean to offend. Anyway, my Surface Pro 4, not possible without modern petroleum-based materials. This projector, not possible without petroleum-based materials. The majority of our clothes require petroleum-based materials. So when we get into modern materials of composites, plastics, 3D printing, and so forth, it's based on petroleum products. Medicine. Anybody on things like insulin? Okay. Or know somebody who is? Well, 95% of our modern medicine comes directly from petroleum precursors. Okay? And lastly, 100%, it's not quite 100%. See that little wiggle sign? That means approximate. But basically 100% of our infrastructure for food across the planet comes from petroleum in terms of fertilizers, pesticides, herbicides, and the fuel to drive the farm equipment. Now, what happened? Okay, oops. So, if we start /when having issues with the economics of petroleum products, it does not hit modern society like our fuel pump. It hits our food, it hits our materials, it hits our clothing, it hits everything. In other words, like it or not, how many have heard of the internet? Okay? Everything we have, if you want to really call it like it is no better than early man burning wood to survive. We power everything, pretty much, except for 4% of hydro. All the renewables don't even count at the scale of planet-wide energy production. How many know a pie chart? You took the planet as a whole and draw a line. The line is bigger than all the renewables. At the end of the day, if we have economic issues, run out, blah, 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 it hits society at 5 points, And since we burn this stuff to make society run through our electricity primarily, as well as our transportation, modern society is injected. Predictions are at present consumption rates, 2050, 2070, game over for modern society. Now, the age demographic of this room, nobody's going to care. But I have 4 granddaughters and families and so forth, they will be around. So, how many people can planet Earth support without modern energy systems? Anybody have an idea?
1 billion.
Yes, around 1 billion hunter-gatherers. Today there's 7 billion. So you look around the room, when we start being pushed for these resources, and by the way, China owns about 75% of the world's material resources now, with deeds and leases on it, because they see it coming. When we have issues on those things, 6 out of 7 die. Now, human arrogance is kind of, well, I'll be one of the 7. Well, statistically, 6 out of 7 don't make it. Our water supply, our food, moving food around, blah, 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 requires energy. And it all comes from petroleum. So it's a big deal. So, 7 billion people today mostly become made possible by modern energy systems. And without that, you get about a billion. So these things I'm talking about in sustainability are pervasive across all aspects of a modern society and all based on burning things. So, some of the references, but roughly if you add all out, you get the 4 billion. About 1.5 billion don't have electricity, and about 3 billion can't afford it. Germany, how many have heard of that country? Woo! Okay, it's one of the world leaders in renewable energy. 20% of its people are on government subsistence because they can't afford the renewable energy. Renewable energy, in terms of just cost, is 10 to 20 times more expensive than petroleum-based energy. So, if you switch over to 50% of your energy is renewable, look, your monthly utility bill goes up. There's no way around it. Can't get something for nothing. I travel a lot in Europe. How many go to Europe? It's kind of funny. Europe kind of verbally hates nuclear power. Guess where 80% of Europe's power comes from? France. And guess what France is? Nuclear. So just not in my, how many heard not in my backyard? Well, Germany sits there and can do all of its 50% renewables because its other 50% is a solid source of France's nukes supplying the energy. So it's kind of hilarious because France and Germany have hated each other for centuries. But the oil embargo of the early 70s, which I remember, actually unified France and Germany. And France said, geez, we'll build the nukes, you do the ag. And they've honored that agreement to this day, 50 years later. It's the longest in history those two countries haven't been at each other's throats. But energy affects everything, and the OPEC oil embargo in the early 70s was a really big deal. So these are kind of just perspective things of why microgrids are important. Okay, next is massive world market. Again, most of the rest of the world is where this is going to go down at scale. How many have seen the big transmission lines running around? Okay. Just rough rule of thumb, $1 million a mile. A coal plant, average coal plant, $5 billion. A new plant, $10 billion. I'll give round numbers. I'm not going to care about plus or minus a billion at $10 billion. That's only 10%. That's with an engineering approximation. The point is, in the developing world where most of the 4 billion exist, you don't have that kind of money laying around. So even if you can afford a new plant, transmission lines, you're not going to be able to afford it. And it just adds up. So these small power systems are going to be a huge deal for the world, as I'll explain subsequently. But the buzzwords you hear today are sustainability, resiliency, and several other things in the world. Okay, so this applies opportunity. I happen to be an entrepreneur, so I like these kind of things. So, trends. I want to show you some trends on this stuff, which is kind of interesting. And no incentives. I don't believe in incentives. Okay? if I incentivized cow manure, we'd get lots of cow manure. Somebody would start saying, hey, I can get the government to pay for 1/3 of it or whatever, and we'd have cow manure everywhere. So if you really want the honest cost of things, get rid of the incentives, which, by the way, if we did for oil, our fuel gap would go to about $10 a gallon. Okay, just as a reminder, the United States government subsidizes all of our gasoline. So, what I have here is actual data. This red line is Kelly's Blue Book average cost of a new car. I've excluded pickups, okay, because I don't need a pickup with a gun and a dog, to be cruising around for, commuting. But that's around $24,000 for the average American new car. Now, as a professor, I'm down here. If you're, a new young married couple with children, you've got an SUV and you're up here. But on average, you're around 24K. The blue dotted line is over the last 8 years. I have a multi-million-dollar research microgrid that I'm going to talk about in a bit. I basically looked, it's a big research facility, no incentives. What's the installed cost? And that blue line is what's been happening since I got the grant back in 2012. Now, if we did a little mathematical trick and plotted this logarithmically, there's something called Moore's Law, which those in the semiconductor industry know a lot about. That would be a straight line following Moore's Law. And basically what that means is, by 2019, this year, the cost, if you did it right, to power the average American home would be less than the cost of an average car. Yes.
You're talking how much battery storage on that 10 kilowatts?
Average American home is 2 kilowatts, 10 kilowatt peaks. So that's the on average. Now, early last year, this is January, so early last year, we put together a system, just priced it out to kind of do this, and it was pretty close to the curve. Well, about the middle of last year, third quarter of last year, we made several breakthroughs on the technologies associated with this, and we can now power the average American home for under $8,000 in small volume. In large volume, we would predict under $5,000. So there's some exciting things coming down the point, consistent with this kind of curve, but breakthroughs occur, changing dynamics. At any rate, I just want to point some of this out because most of our renewable energy is silicon-based. And silicon, as you use it more and more, you know how to produce it better and better, scales go up, our ability to manufacture improves, and prices plummet. So I spent 25 years of my life, mostly my working career prior to academia, in the semiconductor business. This is the model that drives electronics. And since most of our renewable energy comes from solar PV, it follows Moore's Law. And battery storage is very similar in the technology, kind of adds right in there, all wrapped into that one curve. So it's kind of cool. But we've kind of made some breakthroughs and costs are going to come down. So, for the first time in history, last year, some of my research teams showed a path to sustainable personal power. Now, the reason this is important is because today our energy is not personal. How do we get our electricity today? Right, a utility, or a muni, a municipal power producer, or a co-op. But we are not personally kind of in control of that. This is the first time a migration path, to my knowledge, for energy now exists, which could put this into, like a cell phone, personal communications. Except they're not really, because you got AT&T, Verizon, and so on. But anyway, kind of more personal. Also, it's within financial reach. So if globally we can afford an average new vehicle, if you're under $10,000, well, that's roughly half the cost of a new car. that starts getting into the interesting concept range. Now, again, in America, this will not be a big deal. Okay? How many remember the recession of 2007, 8, 9? 50% of Americans are still living paycheck to paycheck, independent of Democrats and Republicans in Washington. So, if you look at any residential market and say, wow, there's like 50 million homes and we can sell and get 10% of them, that's just garbage marketing kind of stuff. Because if 50% of households are living paycheck to paycheck, right away, whatever number of residences you say, half of them aren't going to be able to afford it. Now the other half, so your market also shrunk quite a bit. The other half, it's discretionary. And if you're paying 8 cents a kilowatt hour, which is a very common utility bill rate, do you want to go spend $20,000 when that's a big check, even if it's not that big of a check, because it's only a couple $100 a month type of thing. So in the United States, this, just because of several factors that I just mentioned, will not be that big of a deal unless we get down to that like $5,000 kind. Then it also starts getting pretty cool. So this has some interesting perspectives. I kind of call it choice with sustainability. I put on the customer hat. But if you're a utility, it's called grid defection. Okay, so it's like many things have different points of view, so it depends on which side you're on. Now, I work with the utilities. I like them. A lot of good people. In fact, I'll say this. I believe utilities are more important than the entire medical field. That shocks some people. So I'll predicate that with the following. How many in here are going to die? Okay. Well, if you say never. Well, medicine may improve our quality of life, may sustain it a few years, but ultimately, okay, if we spend trillions, we're all going to die. I don't want to be a hunter-gatherer. That's our choice of modern society, education, our arts, our music, our sports, versus hunter-gatherer. I grew up on the farm. How much of the week does a hunter-gatherer work?
Every day.
Right, 24/7 to survive. There is no discretionary time. So when we really get to a civilization level, electricity, aka power, is more important than medical. Because ultimately medical only stays dying, but society depends on power. Okay? So I think it's kind of important. I worked in the medical industry, as I said. So a lot of power people understand that. And consequently, they realize they're helping society, just like the medical industry realizes it. Just the medical industry doesn't have a public utilities commission to control pricing. Okay, so there's several historic precedences for what is going to happen. Number one, my teams have developed the path to low-cost energy. Well, I work for Control Data, and 70,000 worldwide employees can say they work for Control Data. If you don't remember Control Data, the tower is now down by the Mall of America, kind of an iconic supercomputer mainframe style building. Well, basically, sorry, I went too fast. The PC came out. I was working at Control Data at the time, and they just laughed at the PC. I remember some of the conversations, kind of grim in retrospect, but within 5 years after the PC introduction, Control Data was gone. Now, fortunately, I worked for Imprimis, their hard drive subsidiary, was acquired by Seagate, and Seagate said, oh, Data's great, and they were a great employer. So I personally survived by happenstance, but for the most part, Control Data went the way of the dinosaur because one technology was rapidly supplanted by another low-cost tech that was personal. Okay? Power today is controlled by big monopolies. Personal power for the masses can change that dynamic in much this way, or has the possibility. How many have heard of wind power? Why don't you see small wind turbines anymore? Why is everything going solar
PV
PV?
is cheaper.
No, actually, it's more than cheap.
Too hard to keep going.
Right. And
What was that? I didn't hear that.
too hard to keep going. It's a mechanical versus a solid state. But more importantly than any of that, one of them, how many have worked in the semiconductor industry? Okay. One of the things the semiconductor industry routinely does since its conception is standardize things. So, for example, I have, let's say, the laser pointer box. Here's its form factor. Nobody cares what you put in the box. Any company can put anything they want in the box so long as it's a laser pointer. Any technology that would project light to point, much like this, there's the form factor. That's a standard. How you do it is up to the individual company. But everybody knows the size, everybody knows the shape, so all the manufacturers can rally around the tooling, and just what you put in the box is your own. The small wind industry refused to do that. In 2011 and 12, I was invited to a Senate sub-hearing committee deal out in Washington, and I gave a pitch on what the small wind industry had to do. And at that time, I think there was 12 or 13 small wind companies. All their CEOs and several board members were at this Senate sub-hearing committee. And I said, if you don't standardize, and kind of like, here's an example of how one might, but if you don't standardize, you'll be gone in 5 years. And they laughed. And I was invited back next year to give another talk, and I said, nope, not coming. You laughed. I said, you don't standardize, you're done. They didn't standardize, solar did, bam, we got it. So the semiconductor industry understood this, small wind industry did not. Relic of the dinosaur age.
Why didn't they just change their mind when they were going down?
For the very reason that one of the characteristics that makes America great is entrepreneurialism. If you're an entrepreneur, who calls the shots? Right. And every one of them was started by entrepreneurs. And to standardize means you have to collaborate.
Were they all farmers?
Nope, not at all. But they were very entrepreneurial minded and looked at standardizing as a threat to their psyche of how they did business.
And solar didn't?
Nope. Solar does what we did in the hard drive industry, competes at the shipping dock. The tech you put in your inverters, the tech you put in your panels is up to the company. But a standard solar panel today is roughly 1 meter by 2 meters. That means all your racking gear can be similar, okay? And that lowers cost. So that very attribute worked against the industry. They refused. That's why they're going. Yes.
One of the other things that I noticed is when early in solar we had all different size cells. Somebody decided to standardize a 6x6 cell.
Yeah, well, those are examples, but how that occurs, that's very common, and the point is in the electronic industry, since its inception in like the 50s. So, since inverters, all this great stuff, panels and the like, it's all fundamentally electronics. That philosophy for those businesses sees standardization as good, and it won. Okay, so now we're going to take that technology and move into grids, and to give you a kind of idea of what I call the macrogrid and the microgrid. So here's the United States at night. This is kind of cool. It's the North American continent. The neat thing is it's one machine. It is the world's largest machine. Now, it's not the only such large machine. Europe has one, India has one, China has one, Japan has one. But a grid is one machine. Now, our heart rate on average is 60 beats per minute. The heartbeat of a grid is 60 beats per second. This one machine, when you have 60 hertz here, Over here in Los Angeles, it's exactly in phase, in synchronization, once again at 60 hertz. All operating as one machine. Now, how many remember the show Tool Time? You know, Tim the Tool Man, he liked big machines. He never talked about the grid. And this is a continental-sized machine, which really ticked me off because I really liked the show. But, you know, it's like, hey, you didn't even talk about the world's largest machine. Just because some monster truck's rolling by, hey, that's big compared to my little, you know, Ford or my Toyota Fit or Honda Fit, but, you know, still not that big compared to a continent. So, you know, the kind of thing, one machine. How do we run it? Well, basically, we generate Monticello Nuclear Power Plant, Black Dog Natural Gas now, it used to be coal and so forth. I live down in Burnsville, we really love the stack. Xcel wants to take the stack down, the city of Burnsville said no, we won't allow it. It's kind of our iconic landmark, you know. You gotta remember, in Burnsville, there isn't a whole lot of topology. You know, we got Buck Hill and that smokestack, so it's kind of like, no, you can't take it down even though you don't use it. But we generate, transmit over big distances, and then distribute it. That's the concept of a grid. Now, when we have a microgrid, it's just a little circuit. The only difference between a macrogrid at continental scale and a microgrid turns out to be related to the speed of light. The speed of light on a circuit that's small is pretty much instantaneous. It takes time for light to travel across the distance of a continent, for example, the United States. Now you say, wait a second, it's pretty fast. You're right. It takes about a third of a second. But if you design control systems to run a grid at continental scale, that 1/3 of a second is a big deal. Because one cycle, one heartbeat of 60 hertz, in 1/3 of a second, there's about 20, 30 heartbeats. Well, if our heart stops for 20, 30 heartbeats, we're dead. Okay? On a grid, that amount of time for the speed of light kind of thing means it'd be very hard to control it. So how we control a grid is very different because just of speed of light considerations than how we control a microgrid. Even though they kind of obey the same set of rules, the scale brings a little different physics into it. So, some examples. First of all, I'm kind of compelled to do this stuff for several reasons. Humanitarian-wise, I've been deploying microgrids around the world. I'd already deployed about 4 microgrids before the word microgrid was coined. Okay? Now, most of this was in Africa and Eastern Europe in the early 2000s up to about 2010 timeframe. The word microgrid was coined around 2009. Just to give you a historic preference. So this being 2019, only 10 years ago was the word microgrid formed. And as part of the humanitarian work I do on these kind of things, the Mayo Clinic trained me on how to design power systems for hospitals. Hospitals are a big deal around the world. They need really good control of power. Okay? And things like operating tables, you really don't want the power to go down when you're on the operating table. So how you design for these things is pretty sophisticated. And for some of the humanitarian work I've done, I've designed several hospital power systems. And I didn't know how to do that, so I just cold called the Mayo Clinic and said, hey, I got to do blah, blah, blah for some humanitarian power. They said, hey, that's cool. Why don't you come down and work with our power guys? And for 3 months, they trained me. And I've been using that ever since. They did it free. I only had to commute from Burnsville to Rochester, which a lot of people do, and pretty slick. So, yes?
Are hospitals AC microgrids as opposed to DC microgrids?
They're a mixture.
Oh, they are.
The modern ones are a mixture because it depends upon the particular type of medical device. Modern ones, some are AC, some are DC. Okay, so a modern microgrid in a hospital will actually be blended. Okay? Now, so over the past 14 years, I've deployed a lot of them. Several of them have been for villages, schools, cellular power, and so forth, kind of in the 5 to 20 kilowatt range. Several hospital projects, those are in the 100 to 500 kilowatt range. and a 20 megawatt area in Dodoma, Tanzania for the Dodoma, Tanzania health development. That's probably that was the large one. So I got my start on this stuff in Moldova. How many know where Moldova is? Most Americans will not, because we're all geographically challenged. Moldova is over by the Black Sea. I lived there for 3 years. How many remember about 6-7 years ago now when Russia liberated citizens from the Ukraine? How many remember that? And the world did nothing?
Yeah.
Okay, now, I lived in the region. If you Google a mineral and oil world resource map, you will just coincidentally realize that the liberated Soviet citizens who were living in the Ukraine and being used by the Ukrainian government happened to all reside in the part of the Ukraine where the oil and minerals are. Just so happens, coincidence.
Sure. Yeah, sure.
Oh, that's what the world buzz was. But the depletion of world resources, China owning about 75% of them already, that was Russia staking its turf for what's going to go down in the next 25 or 50 years. They just took it ahead of time so that when the subsequent hard times are going to come, it's not even an issue. After 25, 50 years, nobody's going to look back and say, oh, you took that. No, it's been there so long. It's just, they established the turf on it. How many realize that all of our national parks are collateral for our national debt to China? What? Go Google it. Why do you think China floats our loans? We are about $100,000 in debt per person. That's okay. So China is out there looking at the depletion of resources and already making its call. And that's where world war is going to come, in my prediction. Because, for example, in Nairobi has some of the world's several major deposits of a few minerals that only exist in Nairobi. China owns them. When China in about 20 years goes to the Nairobian government and says, the lease is now due, we're sending our people in, they're going to say no. And then China's going to send its military because they own it. That's what it's going to come down to.
They'll need a wall. That's a joke. Never mind.
So, the point being, people are already being more proactive than a democratic society ever is proactive. Okay? Now, it may not be proactive in a way that's beneficial for humanity, but the data is available. And certain countries are already taking steps to be players at the table when things get tight. Okay? So, when I lived in Moldova, that started being an eye-opener because if you live in another country, you're separate from our government and our media. And you don't quite hear the same story that we get on CNN, Fox, and so forth. So, interestingly enough, there's me at 2003. I still have that code. Okay, professors don't make a lot of money, so that code still works, so I still have it. The guy in the middle is Dr. Yuan Sober. He's the guy that from Moldova, Technical University of Moldova, that I worked with very closely. I really had to laugh because Romanian is the native language of Moldova. Romania and Moldova actually one people group, but after World War II it got split arbitrarily by the Warsaw type of pacts that came after World War II. At any rate, his name in Romania is spelled I-O-N. Well, in English, I-O-N is an ion. So when he was introduced, I said, "Hi, Dr. Ion." And he looked at me, and he goes, He goes, no, in Romanian, I is pronounced with a J. Yuan, which is John. I got to laugh. That was our introduction. Prior to that, it was just email and correspondence. You see those things written, but that was my introduction to start learning Romanian. So Dr. Yuan or Ion, we still are in contact. And we were doing solar work as well as solar dryers in the region. This is where we developed low-head hydro microgrids. Today, that's a big deal. We didn't even think it was a big deal. It was just a natural solution for power in Moldova. What's unique about Moldova is it's the only country in the world that had a grid and lost it. When the Soviet Union collapsed in the early 90s, they had been abusing Eastern Europe for 50 years. Now all of a sudden Mother Russia's government collapses. And there's about something on the order of 1 million troops were in Eastern Europe. Well, they had no government support anymore, no supplies, and they started pulling out. All the people they had been abusing for 50 years started shooting at them. When the Soviet Union was a viable government, if you shot at somebody in the military simply came in and destroyed the whole town. But when Soviet Union collapsed, that couldn't be done. And so the Soviet army, as it left Eastern Europe, did a scorched earth policy in all the countries that did not have a militia. Countries that had a militia could start shooting at the retreating Soviet army, and they didn't do a scorched earth, they just got out. Moldova was one of the countries that was scorched. Its power grid, water, and road infrastructure was totally destroyed by the retreating Soviet army. I was part of a group of engineers and scientists. How do you re-gridize a country that had a grid and lost it? And it turns out you can't. It's too expensive. So we developed what we would call micro power systems. We call them small power systems that can be interconnected to become a grid. Today, that's a very bold concept. We were actually doing it in 2003 and 4 in Moldova. We just didn't think it was that big a deal. It was just an obvious engineering solution. So we didn't publish it. Crap. Anyway.
So you're putting up on those, in that case, are you putting up power, okay, the next slide maybe does that. So you're putting up power lines and all to move power? At each village, we design small power systems. They have a lot of small, streams, like they call, how many, Minnehaha Creek? Well, over there it's called a river. But, you can get low-head hydro, like where it falls over at Minnehaha Falls. You could get 3 to 5 kilowatts off of a little generator on that waterfall. Well, that's could power a whole village if you only need, computer, lights, and so forth. Now, it won't power a movie theater, but, in the developing world, and if you don't have electricity, that's readily done. So we designed the power systems at each village so that they could be interconnected. That way you could afford the cost per one, and as the economy developed, then you could start the interconnection process, one by one, and slowly build out a grid. Well, some of the work we did in Tanzania, this was for the DICHOTOMY Tanzania Health Development. We developed a way, I love engineering in the developing countries because you don't have all your techie toys. Okay, if we put up, how many have seen a wind turbine go up in the United States? Okay, you can't have such cranes in Africa. Number one, there's no roads that'll support such cranes. Number two, the ground's too soft for the weight. So we developed this way to self-erect grid-level wind turbines. These are called lattice towers. We use pole towers in the United States, but if you've been to Africa, buildings are erected floor by floor on poles. So people can erect these without cranes. You can make your own gantry, self-erect the wind turbine and attach blades, and then deconstruct that part, leaving behind a tower with a wind turbine on it. We call this the N+1 solution. This part goes on to the next site, and you duplicate it. And so we developed a way. That's kind of cool because, how many are familiar with laser equipment used in construction today? Okay, if we take our modern laser equipment, it's as good as how flat the Giza Pyramid is. So we can build the Giza Pyramid today using lasers as good as the Egyptians built it. The only crazy thing is they didn't have lasers. So we don't know how they did it, but when you do these things in developing countries, you don't get your techie toys, and so you got to be creative as an engineer. We got a lot of stories like that. Anyway, another power project in Uganda was really hilarious. Here's
main transmission lines, there's the village. Cost $1 million for a grid level transformer. Villages in Uganda, the government isn't going to spend $1 million on a village to give them electricity. So my solution was, I'm just going to put big loops of wire and steal power. Nobody will notice it. Anyway, we were putting up our solar installations and so forth for this microgrid. On the third day, I walk out, and here's the Uganda military with AKs pointed at me. They say, "Want to see your big loops of wire, you're stealing power." I just kind of chuckled to myself, not to them, because you don't chuckle at soldiers pointing AKs at you. Because if they pull the trigger, that's the last thing you remember is a flash, I suppose. But I thought, that's a good thing we got solar panels. So I said, no, we're not stealing your power, we got solar panels. And we took them over to show them. Next day, the president's wife shows up, smooths everything over, and we were in the national paper the third day about how we're doing all this cool humanitarian. One of my favorite all-time pictures is for the first time in this part of Africa, there was lights at night. So it doesn't mean much, it just kind of looks like a dorky black picture, but we had light. By the way, you have to razor wire everything because one solar panel in Africa is a year's wages for an individual. So if you steal a panel, you just made a year's wage. So we razor wire everything so these things don't walk. Okay. Another big project in Liberia, big hospital project, the Phoebe Hospital. For those who have a little power background, I toss in something called a one-line diagram. That's how the power people talk, so now you've seen it. If it doesn't make sense, that's okay. Come out to be a grad student under me, I'll teach you all about it. How many heard of Will Steger? He had designed his power systems as phase 1, which is operating up in Ely right now. We're working on phase 2. But he's got this really cool, what he calls the castle, built out of 100% renewable and sustainable materials. North of Ely, he kind of owns land in the boundary water. He owned it before the boundary waters actually formed, and he was famous by the time the boundary waters were set aside as state park, whatever. And Will was already famous, so they let him keep his land. They didn't eminent domain him. Okay, there's Will, for those who haven't ever seen Will in life, and his part of the installation. Anyway, here's the team putting out the panels. It's a combined propane, diesel, battery, solar, growing to wind, and several other things. It's a pretty cool system. But it's up in Ely. We're finishing up right now a microgrid project for the Minnesota DNR up in the Lake of the Woods area. It's called the Red Lake District. The campus, and we're going to have solar panels here and all kinds of cool stuff for the ranger station up there. So if you've ever been up to, if you're a hockey buff, you know, this is the hockey central of Minnesota up in the Roseau area. This is just south of Roseau by about 20 miles, but that's kind of out in the middle of nowhere, a ranger station. And the co-op can't afford to keep power, so they're ready to shut it off. Anyway, there's its one-line diagram again, just so you've seen these things. Here's the research microgrid, kind of a pictorial one of at St. Thomas. Some of our hardware. By the way, this stuff's expensive. When you start doing grid level microgrids, each one of these things is about $250,000 a pop. So there's $250,000, there's $250,000, there's $250,000, there's $250,000. Pop, 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 pop. So all this adds up really fast. See, it's even shot to the sign. Anyway, out of some of the discoveries out of building all these things, I'm doing the research for a startup, and basically here's kind of the parts of a microgrid, and we've developed a way on all of these areas to lower the cost in the manner I showed you. So we've taken a system point of view and attacked all the cost entry points of a microgrid, and we now have a hot pluggable, volume manufacturable, self-sustainable, self-synchronizing microgrid that can power the average American home for under $5,000 in bulk. And a company called Renew Power Systems, that's part of their business model. I borrowed the slide from them. We shamelessly just cut and pasted it in mine with their permission. But basically, we're taking the standardization route for microgrids to get volume manufacturing. All of the microgrids I showed you, and that wasn't the complete set, and some of the more notable ones, every one of them is a one-off. That's why they're expensive. So what we've developed in my research labs based on that experience base is a standardized way. And inspired by USB for your computers, where you just plug in memory sticks and all kinds of things, but you don't have to turn it off, we now have hot pluggable power systems. And they self-synchronize with no controls. Some very cool stuff. So anyway, that's kind of a bit about the power, some of my work, picture of the world on energy, and questions or anything like that. Next steps. Now here's my quiz. Last quiz. Did I misspell ready? How many say I misspelled ready? Raise your hand if you say I misspelled ready.
Isn't that the way?
Okay?
It's supposed to be an A, not an E.
Actually, see, that's how I test if anybody knows anything about power, because that's ready kilowatt of Minnesota Power prior to formation of Xcel Energy. And if you go to their Rice Street facility, which is just a mile north of the Capitol buildings in St. Paul, there's the Rice Street facility, they still have one of the actual neon ready kilowatts in their garage. And I got a picture of it because I worked there. But anyway, that's kind of my case. So that's kind of my talk on microgrids, a bit about power, some of the physics, some of the things I've done and so forth. I'm done. Yes?
Well, you said at the beginning that the United States wouldn't use microgrids that much.
Oh no, I said they wouldn't be important as the rest of the world. It's not to say there won't be microgrids in the United States. There will be. The market is a world market. So 4 million people are not as many as 4 billion people. And so the kind of things I'm working on in this technology, its real home is in the world. Some will be built in the United States, some will be deployed, and so forth. But it won't be as big a deal in the States as for the world at large.
Well, the reason I asked the question is because I was thinking of how terrorists have threatened to ruin the electric grid.
Well, working at Xcel Energy, in one day I could shut down the whole United States.
Right. So
There are
that
4
means-
substations that handle 80% of our power.
Oh my gosh.
I know where they're at. If you work in power, you know where they're at.
And so
if
that would
you
be the
Google
advantage of microgrids.
If you
in the
Google
United
them,
States.
they're whited out on Google Maps, which is really, if you're a terrorist, you know, I got this region that's whited out. Why did they white it out? It's kind of like Roswell, you know. All so we're just going to show you Roswell. We're going to have a big white area that you can't see.
Say it again.
Yes, there was a question
Well,
right here.
So
and
that
then
was her point.
So
Yeah.
why would we not try and change to microgrids?
Costs money.
So
It
that
costs 20 times what we pay for electricity.
Yeah,
50%
but at
of
the wall
America.
only costs $5 billion.
50% of
You know, that's supposed to be
Americans
about
are living
security.
paycheck to paycheck. It's beyond our economic capability. I don't apologize. That's the data. It's just that way. I mean, could we, if we weren't, you gotta understand, the United States is $20 trillion in debt, folks, and 50% of our brothers and sisters are living paycheck to paycheck. When you're in debt and you're living paycheck to paycheck, that means you do not have discretionary money to go do things that you might need for infrastructure. It's hard. Okay? Doug, we're out of time, so we're starting to creep. I always try to do this.
We'll give you a
questions.
few extra minutes anyway for questions, but I'm just curious, one of the things we hear about energy, and I grew up on a farm without electricity kind of thing, but what I keep hearing now is energy is a critical thing in the world, but water is even more critical. In your experience in traveling around to these places, do you think that's true?
That's true, but it's a bit misleading because electricity is used in the majority of it to purify it through such things as reverse osmosis and heating.
Sure.
So while water's a big deal, guaranteed, the modern systems that purify it all run off electricity.
Yeah.
So it's what we call dependent systems. So our fresh water supply is not independent of our grids. So if our grid shut off, what was it, Sandy hit the East Coast, they ran out of fresh water in like 3 days because the electricity is what pumps our water around. And so that's an example of the dependence of fresh water on a functioning grid. Okay, so they are not the same thing, but their operating systems are interrelated.
Interconnected.
Yep. Yeah, you have a
Well, I
question?
was just gonna say, Camp David, for example, in Maryland, is shown on Google Maps as forest, as plain forest. So substations, they could, you know.
Yeah, I know, it's kind of funny. Oh, where's Camp David? Well, maybe that's over in Jerusalem, because that's where David's from.
There is a Camp David, and I know where it is.
Yeah.
But, and other people do too.
Wait, are you CIA? Check it out.
But you could look on Google Maps, and it's just like the rest of the forest.
Yeah.
It is.
I haven't looked at it, I'll have to go look.
Well, don't they could do that with substations? They wouldn't have to make it white.
Yeah, well, I know one of them's whited out, at least it was a year ago. Yes?
So this $5,000 amount that you say would be a microgrid.
For the average American home.
Right,
Like
yeah.
Prince, for example, God bless his soul, he's not around. His home isn't average.
Right, no, for the average American home, 5,000, and what to pay back on, you know, how long.
I don't care.
Doesn't.
Doesn't matter. It's $5,000.
Okay.
That's the whole point.
But
I
at
mean,
some point, you're,
no, the idea,
that's for a fully
no, I'm
sustainable.
changing my philosophy and what I've been driving research into product is to change the mentality. If I simply make it so inexpensive, people stop worrying about how I pay for it.
So 5,000, you're off the grid. You're
And 2-3 years if Renew Power System gets funded and the manufacturing, I've been down this road about 7 times now as an entrepreneur. Several things have to happen to be successful. If that pans out, in about 4 years, you'll be able to buy such a system. And it'll be around in the United States 4 to 8K. And that's starting to get into the
and then
range.
separate off the grid completely.
Well, the reason I've been working on this is another reason is, okay, this is important, so let's take a few minutes. How many have heard of Chevron? Okay, there's roughly 15, 18 oil companies on the planet. Anybody have an idea what the quarterly profit for the average oil company is? It's around $15 billion every quarter is their profit. And there's 15, 20 oil companies. So every oil company every year is net profit is something on the order of $60 billion. And there's 15, 20 of them. I do not believe it's possible. I can buy people's souls because of world ethics and corruption for the chump change of one oil company's annual profits. I can buy governments. In Tanzania, I can get you killed for $50. And I'll have people lining up to do it for $50 because the average yearly income is 25. So I do not believe there's a way to get off the wagon unless I can change the economic dynamic. If I can make it so inexpensive that everybody can have it, like a cell phone. I mean, how many even hear of landlines anymore? Okay? I heard of them, I read about them in history books. But the point is, even in the developing world, there's no landlines, it's all cellular. If I can change the economic dynamic, I can alter it. If I can get the cost of these things down, then the grassroots masses can afford it and has another option. But I don't believe we're going to be able to change in a time that's going to help the planet.
We could increase taxes on the oil companies.
Welcome to the United States. Yes.
I read or heard somewhere that India has a plan to be a world leader in microgrids.
Yep.
So are you helping them or in competition with them or?
It's a big world. Even when a subcontinent starts doing something, it takes time. So there's plenty to go around. I only want 1% of the $1 trillion market.
So
I'm not greedy.
Are they really advancing on that?
Not yet, but over the next 10 years, yes, because today their train system emits more pollution and their cellular system emits more pollution than all their combined industry.
How do you see the microgrid spreading out? Is it going to be companies that actually put all the pieces of the puzzle together and they sell the blocks that goes out?
Well,
or is it
that's the model that I'm on the board for Renewable Power Systems. If you want to sell components, you're at the bottom of the food chain economically. If you want to make money, be Hewlett Packard and sell systems. Be IBM and sell systems. That's where the money's at. So I've taken that model, which is why my research focused on the entire microgrid, not the panels, not the inverter, everything. How it plays together, cost trade-offs for the system and so forth. And that's how I've been able to get the cost down with several breakthroughs.
And they'd be scalable, then, up to the village.
Well, we feel it's scalable easily up to about 20 kilowatts. But that Uganda village now has lights and schools that with internet and computers, 1.5 kilowatt. So 20 kilowatts, yeah, see, we, Americans don't have a sense of how much power a kilowatt is. I mean, an LED light bulb is 7 watts and I can light a room. This thing is consuming about 10 watts and I can run my engineering software, access the web, and do all kinds of things for 10 watts. A kilowatt is 100 of these things. So I can have a whole school learning with that and those kind of powers. So a couple of kilowatts is, for a lot of the world, it's a lot of power. Now there's an unfortunate problem with this. Once everybody gets it, they go, I want more. I want that big TV. I want lights and I want air conditioning. But at least getting started is pretty straightforward. Yes.
Are you looking outside the U.S. market, like in Africa or something?
Yeah, the whole focus is outside the U.S. because that's where the market is.
And is there a product that you have ready with, a timeline for when it'll be ready?
I can put you in touch with the CEO. The answer is I do the research, so I'm not really privy to all the details. I don't even want to know the business details. I just do the tech. By the way, I worked at Seagate. When I was there, we were shipping 500,000 hard drives a day. I know volume manufacturing, so I know how to do things in volume. So they're looking at volume of 10,000 to 100,000 a year. That was like third of the shift of stuff we did at Seagate. So it's like, I can handle that volume easily.
Okay, one more question, then we're gonna have to, okay, Steve, you got it.
Still devil's advocate, hasn't the United States deployed microgrids almost ubiquitously through big box stores, hospitals, and schools with their backup generators?
Not ubiquitously.
Well, not ubiquitously, but we already have thousands, if not a million.
Well, and really, the distinction is the following.
That way.
The distinction is the following. Those aren't renewably based. They're running diesel gensets. I was in the Navy during the Vietnam War. USS Mount Vernon, we carried SEAL teams around. Okay, our ships were microgrids. Ships do not have lines going to a new power plant. They have their own generation, but we were burning fuel. Okay, so microgrids exist in cars, planes, trains, automobiles, ships, and hospitals, and so forth. They are all unique to the system. They are not volume produced. And they are by and large not sustainable because the majority of them are running on petroleum products. So the distinction of what I was talking about is a sustainable, renewable path in those systems. But in terms of the physics, how they operate, same. And well noted and not argued about.
And did you pay MSP or ask for permission for Ready Kilowatt?
I just want to mention too, being an old guy like I am, when we were talking, I was telling him I was in the Air Force back in the mid-'60s, and we were running microgrids.
Yeah.
I mean, it was just part of what we did. So it's definitely not new. Anyway, thank you. Let's give him a hand.